My name's Rohan Sequeira. I am a cardio-endocrinologist. So basically, I handle cardiology and endocrinology problems. I've been practicing medicine for about 30 years now and have been in THR and harm reduction for tobacco-based products since the last 8 years. One of the reasons why I got into THR was because most of the people who use tobacco-based products end up in our clinics with all sorts of problems, and thought that it's better to attack the root cause rather than go into, managing the other issues. And I found that THR was the way to go ahead with reduction of harm.
Okay, great. So we've got now about a decade of data, maybe more of real-world use of e-cigarettes specifically, and nicotine pouches now coming up behind it. What's the most important thing that data tells us, and what remaining uncertainties do you see?
Well, the thing that this 10 years of data, this decade of data gives us the first-hand information is that it breaks the perception that nicotine causes cancer and nicotine is responsible for most of the issues. But this 10 years of data has shown that it's not nicotine that causes all the problems that we see medically or psychologically. It's the combustion and it's the form of tobacco. So the data has done a very, very significant shift, paradigm shift in thinking that nicotine is not as bad as what it was said to be, but it's the tobacco that causes most of the harm.
Okay, we were talking earlier before you came on, and you were saying that you'd been involved in some of the investigations on Ozempic and GLP-1 type drugs.
Right.
I interviewed Derek Yak for this channel a little while ago, and he was saying, there are really 3 major population level health innovations that will drive the improvement in life expectancy and quality of life over the next 20 years. Nicotine and tobacco harm reduction, GLP-1 type drugs, and the increase in vaccinations through technologies like that which has been developed by Moderna.
I think what Derek said was absolutely spot on, and there is a huge paradigm shift in the management of long-term weight gain issues. We see that, weight, or people who are overweight or obese have definitely a 7 times higher risk of getting cardiac, diabetic, cholesterol, and even, blockages in the arteries in the legs and in the heart and even in the brain. GLP-1 receptor analogues have shifted that the balance, and they're bringing people more into better health. And one of the things where I see that there's a slight overlap between GLP and tobacco harm reduction, and this is not something which is common knowledge, but one of the actions of GLP-1 is that it reduces cravings for food. Now, if you understand, there's a common pathway for addiction, and that's dopamine. So there is investigation going on right now and people are looking into how GLP-1s can also be used, concurrently in people who are obese and using tobacco as well, to reduce craving for tobacco as well, or even nicotine. So there is some commonality between THR and GLP-1s in the future, where people who have been using, because when you take a GLP-1, you just don't feel like eating because your cravings have all come down, right? Of course, there are other effects, but nicotine works by increasing your craving, right? So if a GLP-1 receptor analog is going to give you a slight benefit in the reduced need for nicotine, that creates a window of opportunity to decrease the dose of nicotine over a period of time and bring the people out. So it's called a dose de-escalation. I have many patients who are on Ozempic, and they're also smokers. And when we shifted them to THR products, I did a kind of an experiment with about 10 of my patients. And I started reducing the nicotine levels over a period of 1.5 years. And we found that these patients who took reduced levels of nicotine, a dose de-escalation over 1.5 years, were much more compliant with the dose de-escalation than those who weren't on Ozempic. So that's open for discussion. But
okay, that's interesting. Do you think that sort of investigation might be something that Novo and Eli Lilly are interested in doing on a wider scale?
There's a very big fear factor in any of the pharmaceutical companies to touch nicotine in any way, unless they're into nicotine replacement therapies like the lozenges or the patches. I don't see that research coming from the companies, but maybe that leaves a very big window for THR doctors to look into that aspect.
So why are the pharmaceutical companies so scared of addressing one of the biggest public health challenges that exists in the world today?
it's all about walking on thin ice on hot water. All of a sudden they get in the spotlight for being pro-tobacco, pro-nicotine, which they don't want to do. Whereas it is a very big opportunity. You have so many billions of people work all over the world using tobacco in some form or the other, suffering the harms of it. It makes a lot of sense for companies which are into GLP-1 to look at this as a possible approval for getting products which can reduce nicotine or any other dependence-based issues.
Okay. The pharmaceutical industry has developed drug-based therapies outside of nicotine replacement therapy to reduce addiction levels.
Right.
But why in this particular instance?
Yeah, so those drugs which you're talking about, you're referring to like varenicline or bupropion or the other Wellbutrin, all the other combinations which they use for reduction, they were specifically targeting only smokers or tobacco users. It wasn't a dual action drug. For example, GLP-1s primarily meant for people with diabetes, with obesity, with cardiac problems, people who have, they're prone to get kidney disease. Even to a large extent, the new research is showing that it has got crazy effects, really good effects on the liver, so reversal of fatty liver disease. Now, when that's there, their entire segment is very, very much a medical segment. It's what we call as the cardiometabolic segment, right? Now, using that same drug and bringing it into nicotine is something which they'll have to decide internally, but it makes a lot of sense. If there is a dose dependent, if you are able to reduce cravings in a person who's smoking long term for tobacco, makes a lot of sense.
Tell me how you first discovered reduced risk nicotine products and how you integrated them into clinical practice.
Well, to be honest, I was a smoker before. I used to smoke about one packet of cigarettes a day, and one day I was just examining a patient and I was over him and with my stethoscope on his chest, and he was one of my patients, and he's like, "Doc, do you smoke?" I can smell the tobacco. And the next day he comes to my clinic. This was about 8 years ago. The next day he comes to my clinic with a vape device. I said, "This is for you." I was like, I've never seen this before. And then, being the curious mind that I am, I went through all the data and looked at it from a very, non-biased view, a very neutral point of view, not for, not against. And as I started reading about this, as I started getting into the deeper science of THR, it made a lot of sense to me. I said, there's millions of people dying every year. This thing should be mainstream. Why is it not? And that created that curiosity on me. I shifted completely to THR products. I haven't touched a single tobacco-based product for the last 8 years. In my own health, I saw my lipid profiles improve. I saw my breathing quality improve. And it's not something which I can look at somebody else and say, oh, he said it. Something I felt myself. So, I did my pulmonary function test. It came out pretty clear. There was absolutely no risk factors involved. And that convinced me personally at a personal level and then also at a scientific level. So I started using it in my patients. I started seeing in many of them the same results that I saw in myself. So if 2 + 2 = 5, then might as well look beyond. And that's the reason why I'm in THR for the last 8 years.
And have you received much pushback from the medical community, who I guess know what you're doing?
I've received a lot of pushback from the medical community and then some, because most of it is all about the propaganda, and I call it propaganda because most of it is funded by various organizations to create a certain narrative that THR is bad. But doctors usually don't have that much of an open mind when you're looking at something which has been traditionally linked to cancer, which has been traditionally linked to cardiac disease directly. So it's very difficult to break the ice and give them a perspective that, it's not this, but it's the nicotine that doesn't cause the harm. So take away the harm from tobacco. It's a very difficult process to convince people.
What forms is the pushback that you're getting taken? Are other doctors contacting you personally? Is there a level of professional isolation that you suffer on this basis? How does it manifest itself?
Well, it's usually, I see that in our medical community groups, but they won't come up and talk to me personally because of my seniority in some ways. But, when it's in a group or when it's in a discussion, then there's that you can understand it's more of an animosity, and I don't understand why. It's like they refuse to believe the facts in front of them. And that's where I see one opportunity is maybe if one of the organizations which is working with THR, and I've spoken about this to a lot of people, I haven't seen anybody doing something about it, But maybe what's really needed is, a kind of medical literacy program meant for doctors, which demystifies nicotine in a very easy to understand way.
I mean, I guess the pushback that you might get from that would be a lot of the tobacco companies have tried that, and it always blows back on them and on harm reduction in general in a negative way. Is there any way around, the fact that the primary vendors of these products are legitimately discredited businesses that have behaved appallingly in the past?
Yes. I think it's better if third party, or maybe if people who are not associated with tobacco companies start doing that. And I think there's a couple of them at this event also, where Carolyn, for example, she works with medical literacy programs for doctors and all the other stuff. But I think at this present point of time, it's not conducive for tobacco companies themselves to go out with this, because it just looks like they're selling their product, right? But there is a science behind it, and there is a legitimate science behind it. It's not just, all smoke. There is hardcore data that supports that nicotine does not cause cancer. Nicotine does not cause all the effects, but it's tobacco. And I think that literacy program for medical professionals, it may not or may not create a very big dent, but at least it makes people aware that THR is definitely a valid concept.